So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now coming to the session about the early history of the omega-3. We tend to be occupied by the present and the future, and we are also forgetting of very often the past. The reason we are here is the work of the pioneers that opened up the science of the omega-3 in the field of human nutrition. Now we have the pleasure and the opinion to learn more about the work of some of those pioneers. The first session is the early history, the Ralph Holman legacy, which Dr. Bibus is going to present. Bibus was a student, Dr. Bibus was a student of Dr. Ralph Holman. Dr. Bibus was a student of Dr. Ralph Holman, the legendary omega-3 researcher and grandfather of the omega-3. Let's welcome Dr. Bibus to the stage.
Thank you, Baldor. It's a real honor to be here. Just had a pleasant call from Adam Ishmael to talk about my former boss, mentor, and good friend, Dr. Ralph Holman. I had this distinct luxury of being in his life for about 27 years as a student researcher and as a friend, and then eventually somebody who looked after Dr. Holman in his final years. But this is Dr. Ralph Holman. Like many of the older omega-3 researchers I know, happy, optimistic, wonderful, hardworking people. Ralph is the father of omega-3 fatty acids, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about his personal life and a little bit about his research and how that kind of impacted some of my directions in life. So Ralph was a graduate student during World War II, and Dr. Holman was studying Ralph Holman at the time was studying carbohydrate metabolism. One morning he eagerly went to the laboratory of Dr. Al Neer, who was a mass spec physicist who was good at purifying radioisotopes, and found that the lab was completely dark, mass specs were off, it was empty. Al Neer's group had left to work on purifying uranium for the Manhattan Project. Ralph had no more source of heavy carbon dioxide to study carbohydrate metabolism. He serendipitously met Dr. George and Mildred Burr a few years earlier and switched to a path of studying fat, which was a new thing back in the late 20s and early 30s, and that began a career of about 60 years of studying fat. My friend and colleague, Dr. Gary List, now retired from the USDA, has a wonderful quote about Dr. Holman. Ralph Holman's life story should be an inspiration to everyone. A Depression-era young man coming from a modest, hardworking family who was a committed Christian and developed into a world-class biochemist is emblematic of the American dream. Ralph was born in 1918 in South Minneapolis. He was the son of wonderful people, but relatively poor people at the time. When he was about 10, it was the start of the Great Depression. These are some early pictures of Dr. Holman. This is a 1918 car seat right here. You can see that Dr. Holman was into animal research at age 4. Ralph always looked good, always dressed nice. Ralph was not athletic, but he did have prowess for stretching and bending and doing interesting things like that. But, he was educated at Bethel College. It was a Baptist school in the St. Paul, then at the University of Minnesota to finish his bachelor's degree, Rutgers, where he finished his master's degree, and then the University of Minnesota, where he got his PhD. He lived in Minneapolis, and Bethel College was over in St. Paul. His family didn't have enough money to go to school. Ralph had no way to go to school in those days. His high school teachers knew that he was bright, hardworking. They talked to him. They talked to Bethel University, and if he was willing to work as a janitor, they were willing to give him a free education. That's something that he never forgot. That was his chance. That was his chance to separate from his dire situation. Ralph walked or biked each day to Bethel University 5 miles. You'd get killed in a car accident or if you're on a bike today in that part of the world. But he had enough money at the end of each quarter for a haircut and an ice cream cone. That was his luxury at the time. And this was, Dr. Ansel Keys was on his his defense committee for his PhD. Dr. Holman was not particularly fond of Dr. Ansel Keys. This was Rutgers University. Began a lot of animal research looking at vitamin D at the time and also essential fatty acids. One big piece of history in Dr. Holman's life was the chance meeting of beautiful Carla Calais on a blind date. Ralph loved this woman more than life itself. They were a wonderful pair throughout life. Many great stories, many great times. Ralph took her on a 4-day bike trip of Grand Marais, which is a very woodsy part of Minnesota, and young city Carla from New Jersey has a look of disdain on her face after spending 4 days in rain biking around woodsy areas of northern Minnesota. But she was a real trooper and a definite love of Ralph's life. Shortly after his PhD, Ralph went to be a postdoc with Hugo Thorell and Sune Bergstrom. In the day, there was no airplanes to Sweden or any Europe. He took a boat. So, but he actually crystallized lipoxygenase in 1946 was one of his big achievements. After Sweden, he was first a professor at Texas A&M, but then received a job at the Hormel Institute at the University of Minnesota, which was a food research department developed by Dr. J. Hormel. Ralph moved from Texas to Minnesota, carrying a lot of his laboratory equipment and a desk that I proudly sit at every day. This operation here had a top speed of 30 miles an hour before the trailer started to shimmy really bad. And it was very hot, so they traveled from midnight to 3 p.m. each day with blocks of ice in their car. That was air conditioning at the time with a newborn baby boy. So he arrived at the Hormel Institute, and this is where he started his career. The Hormel Institute eventually built into a bigger place, and now it's a mammoth cancer research center as well. But this is Dr. Holman in his laboratory. In 1950, he built a gas chromatograph himself. A lot of scientists at the time built their own instruments. Al Neer built his own mass specs. So he started to analyze blood and was interested in essential fatty acids in humans. And he reported in 1950 one of the first essential fatty acid deficient cases in humans and on into children looking at fat-free TPN. Some of his major contributions in life, really one of the first people to analyze omega-3 with a process called alkaline isomerization, looked at double bond configurations. His GC used a glow plug from a model airplane for the FID detector for the source of electricity. The first case of omega-3 deficiency was actually his mother, who had an infarction in her bowel, and she was fed TPN with no lipid nutrition at all. So they just fed sugar, calories essentially at the time. He's accredited with the definitive omega-3 essentiality in a case 1982 with Holman and Hatch. He discovered the metabolic conversion of linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid into their long-chain counterparts with Hans Mohauer in the early 60s. Also the competitive nature of those two fatty acids for delta-6 and delta-5 desaturase. Mead's acid, James Mead was in Holman's laboratory. They described the triene-tetraene ratio as a biomarker for essential fatty acid deficiency. He studied orchids, fragrances. I ran thousands of samples of fragrance through the mass spec for him and carefully documented those. One of the big advantages of the Hormel Institute was the ability to purify pure fatty acids. And a lot of us buy our standards from New Czech Prep in Elysian, Minnesota. New Czech Prep was started at the Hormel Institute under the guise of Dr. Holman and later became a private business. We made fish oil capsules in the early 80s with fish oil that we were generously given by Omega Protein, Zapata-Haney at the time, to do clinical trial studies. I wasn't very good at it and people complained, but established deficits of DHA in pregnant women, the widespread omega-3 deficiency in our country and across the world by looking at populational studies. We also did work to solve the problem. We fed flax to chickens to increase omega-3 in eggs, pork and chicken. Omega-3 eggs have actually done well, but this is taken from Ralph's memoirs from quite a while ago. We now believe that many diseases are enhanced by omega-3 deficiency and that restoring our intake of omega-3 to higher, more natural levels will make diseases of man less of a threat. He's got a lot of publications. He was prolific, did a lot of science, had a lot of collaborations. He had a lot of postdocs. He was added to the National Academy of Sciences in 1982. At that time, there was only about 1,500 members worldwide. It was a big deal for a fatty acid scientist. He was the director of the Hormel Research Institute from 1975 to 85. President of the AOCS. He was founding editor of Progress in Lipid Research, which many of us read, and also the Lipids Journal for AOCS. He's won several awards, AOCS Award in Lipid Chemistry, the prestigious Alton E. Bailey Award, Baldwin Award, and several others. So he studied essential fatty acids with George and Mildred Burr. 18-3 or alpha-linolenic acid wasn't described as essential until a case where a young lady had a gunshot wound and she was fed parenterally or through her veins with just linoleic acid as an essential fatty acid. And that person started to develop paralysis, episodic visual problems that actually led her to be bedridden. They added omega-3 fats back to her diet. They measured her blood, added omega-3 back to her diet, and she actually recovered fully. So that's the classical case for the essentiality of omega-3. These are some of the visuals. Fat-free. Well, we know fat-free diets are bad, right? No omega-3, no omega-6. Growth problems. Scruffy fur. Again, growth problems. Observation in dogs. This is by Errol Hansen. He was an MD at the University of Minnesota. George and Mildred Burr. Mildred was his lab technician, George's lab technician. They fell in love and got married. Dr. Hansen and Hilda Weiss, she was his lab technician. They fell in love and got married. So there's a lot of romance around essential fatty acid research. But you can see the dog on the right was essential fatty acid deficient. This is from 1942. But Errol Hansen went down to Texas, and they couldn't measure fatty acids at the time, but they could measure the level of polyunsaturation in blood. And these kids with intractable eczema, a real problem in the day, had low levels of polyunsaturation. And when they fed them sources of polyunsaturates, they resolved. And this was in the early 50s. So this is one of the first clinical cases, if you will, of essential fatty acid therapy. Holman went on with Widmer with alkaline isomerization, one of the first determinations of polyunsaturation in the blood. Couldn't measure it at the time. Fat-free diets produced a decrease in PUFA, and feeding 18-2 omega-6 increased a tetraene. He didn't know what the tetraene was, but a tetraene, 4 double bonds. We now know that's arachidonic acid. And feeding 18-3 or alpha-linolenic acid increased a pentaene and a hexaene, so EPA, DPA, and DHA. I asked Ralph, I didn't know a lot about Ralph when I became a student of his, and I kept discovering all these wonderful things about Dr. Holman, and I found out that he was the guy that gave us the word omega-3. He was the inventor of the term omega-3, and I said, where did that come from? And he said, Doug, that came from Sunday school. He said, I learned that when I was 10 years old. This is Dr. Holman in 1928 from the phrase, I am the alpha and I'm the omega. In the early 1960s, Dr. Holman was looking for a word that described the end of the fatty acid. I'm the alpha and I'm the omega. I'm the beginning and I'm the end. And that's where omega-3 came from. So it was first published in a paper in 1963 with Hans Mohauer that talked about the competitive nature of omega-6 and omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. So this same paper demonstrated that 18-2, linoleic acid, linolenic acid, and arachidonic acid could all improve dermatitis related to essential fatty acid deficiency in rats, and that dietary linoleic acid increased liver arachidonic, and that dietary ALA increased EPA and DHA in rats. And this is the graphic that from that paper that showed us that increasing amounts of ALA omega-3 increased levels of DHA, DPA, and EPA and DHA in tissue lipids of animals. And you can note that a very small inclusion, less than 0.5% of ALA, correlates with a profound increase in levels of DHA. So animals are very capable of this conversion. The same is true for linoleic acid. Increasing linoleic acid increased primarily in arachidonic acid. And again, at the time, relatively small amounts of linoleic acid led to a fairly profound increase of arachidonic acid. That led to this slide that most graduate students have in their presentations. But it's impressive because these kind of slides and these kind of figures are in every textbook today that discusses fatty acid nutrition. So my friend and colleague was responsible for that. So one other really important thing that Ralph did was establish the competitive nature of linoleic acid and linolenic acid for delta-6 desaturase in the elongase enzymes. So if you fed a consistent amount of linoleic acid, 0.6% of energy was considered to be an optimal level of linoleic acid at the time to prevent essential fatty acid deficiency. And you increase the amount of ALA omega-3, you could profoundly decrease arachidonic acid. This is again in liver lipids in animals. The contrary, suppression of omega-3 metabolism by omega-6. If you fed a 1% caloric content of ALA and then increased linolenic acid from 0 to 15%, you can see a very profound suppression of DHA synthesis, EPA synthesis, and DHA synthesis. And again, in today's context, Americans eat 7 to 10 energy% of linoleic acid, truncating that conversion. One of the things we did with Ralph was look at different populations around the world. Ralph was very interested in what types of food people ate and their blood levels of omega-3. We ran thousands and thousands of samples from different populations around. Fish eaters, people living in Sweden, Ralph was Swedish, had obviously high levels. This is percent of omega-3 in plasma phospholipids. Kerala Indians ate a lot of coconuts. We knew they had a high saturated fat intake. We didn't realize they also lived in a coastal area and ate a whole lot of fish. So they were fish eaters as well. But one of the interesting caveats was Nigerians. These were poor people that were living on staple foods, not a whole lot of fish in their diet, but not a lot of processed oils and foods. And their linoleic to linolenic acid ratio was relatively balanced. And these folks had some of the higher levels of total omega-3. We did like 3 or 4 more studies with Nigerians, pregnant moms, and babies, and saw this same response. But what troubled Dr. Holman the most was that Americans were way down on the list. In that American children, this is a control population from Chicago for a cystic fibrosis study, were the lowest on the list. So it's very attuned to omega-3 levels in diet. Again, populations plotted for total omega-3 versus total omega-6. Populations like our Minnesota control group with high amounts of omega-6 correlated with relatively low amounts of omega-3, and countries with people with high omega-3 had low levels of omega-6. So that's a balance that we've learned from Dr. Holman and Dr. Lands and several other people as well. We went on to look at kids. Infants were low in DHA. We looked at children that were 10 to 12 years old in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, again, very low, even lower than our US adult populations. This was a study we did with Alan Sinaiko, who was finding insulin resistance, obesity, a lot of cardiovascular risk factors already in our kids at age 10 to 12 years old. That was very disturbing to Dr. Sinaiko. But again, our colleagues to the south, our children that are relatively poor, had much better DHA values, and also Russian children from Vladivostok and their mothers had much better DHA status. And this is the data for Russian babies from Vladivostok. We had to smuggle the laboratory equipment in from Seattle. We tried to send it through Moscow by DHL, and we were asked for $10,000 more for the person to sign his name. So we found a sailor that was willing to take it for $5 a kilo from Seattle to Vladivostok, which is an eastern port. So it was kind of a neat study and precious data. But this is Nigeria, and this is the US. This is the Mayo Clinic. I live about 40 minutes from the Mayo Clinic, the epicenter of good medical care for mothers, and yet moms from the Mayo Clinic have about a third, infants from the Mayo Clinic have about a third the DHA level as people from Russia and poor kids from Nigeria. Ralph liked to look at fatty acid profiles of everything and was interested in sick people as well. And being close to the Mayo Clinic, we had the chance to look at thousands of samples from hundreds of different disease states. And the take-home, Ralph used to go through every disease state and document different essential fatty acid deficiencies of omega-3 and omega-6. But the take-home is that being sick is a stress on your omega-3 level and often on your omega-6 level as well. We did it for, again, another group of patients as well. Lab life in the Holman lab. I was a kid and I was incredibly blessed to land in a very friendly, warm, and supportive environment. I've worked in all kinds of different environments, and in retrospect, it was just a godsend. Every day we worked with rats, lots and lots of rats, mice, humans as well. We made our own diets. There was a lot of fish oil going on. Again, omega proteins of Patahini had some of the first bulk oils that we used in a lot of research. Constant smell of chloroform and methanol. If I forget your name, it's not because I don't like you, it's because I've been exposed to so much chloroform in my lifetime. And a lot of GCs. Our GC runs back then were 60, 70 minutes long, and we had Pat Collins even when I first showed up on the scene in the mid-'80s, and now we run a GC run in 6 minutes or so. But we had daily lab meetings that were really inspirational for a young person, a lot of PhDs and smart laboratory personnel. We had coffee. Holman would bring in his cake that he made with flaxseed and maybe canola that had omega-3. It was dry and awful, but we all smiled and said, yeah, it was wonderful. And a lot of trivia questions, and we analyzed the hell out of everything. So some of the notable postdocs, Hans Mohauer. Hans Mohauer went on to lead the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the EU. James Mead, Howard Sprecher, the Sprecher Shunt, went to Ohio State, wonderful individual. John Kramer from Canada. Bill Christie, who's did more to teach us about lipid analysis really than I think anybody in the world today. Wonderful individual. Armand Christophe from Belgium. Peter Egwim from Lagos, Nigeria. And a friend and colleague, Dr. Steve Finney, who is a medical doctor who does a lot writing about low carbohydrate diets and essential fatty acid health today. But Ralph, as a child, spent his summers at a farm, his parents' farm in Uppsala, Minnesota, of all places, just like Sweden. It was a Sweden of the north. He built his own cabin to resemble a Swedish cabin. He did this all by hand. Ralph, growing up in the Depression, was for lack of a better word, very tight with his money, but he built this beautiful cabin, and he finished that in 1959. He entertained lots of friends there. He grew orchids. In 1976, he published a paper that referred to the Holman bog. He had a way of growing showy lady slippers, which is Minnesota's state flower. It's a type of orchid, and he's the first individual ever to grow a triplet in captivity. Not easy to do, I guess, but this is a poster that Dr. Holman has. If anybody would like one, I'd be happy to share one with you. Was a member of the Royal Orchid Society. In the back of his house, he had a 3-story greenhouse that had about 1,000 orchids in it that I helped him every summer take them out and descale and make them pretty again. And Ralph was he loved history. He loved family history, church history. He wrote and documented the lives of his own family, but his wife's family and also his church. This is in Ralph's basement. He was there a lot, and he loved to write, and he was a fantastic writer. Family was incredibly important to Dr. Holman. This is Carla in later years and their son Ted. This is his cousins, farmer guys from northern Minnesota that he loved to hang out with. This is Christmas. Christmas was an incredibly important season for Dr. Holman. Lots of cards, gifts, gatherings, and presents. This is Dr. Holman's care team. He called us his Omega Kids. When Dr. Holman got older, he needed a little more oversight, and he asked me to kind of core that team. This is Angela Helly. She was his lawyer from Bethel University. I had a friend, Lola, who loves to talk. And Dr. Holman was a very shy person, but he also loved to talk. And we linked these two up, and it was a wonderful joining. And Lola took care of him in his later years. And this was Pastor Jim Peck, who was his minister. But this was Dr. Holman about age 92, a few years ago in the nursing home. Very upbeat, positive, wonderful person. A quick slide. Holman was a techie. He liked innovation and new things, and he bought one of the first computers in 1971 that cost like $50,000, and you could do like simple mean regression with punch cards. And he sprung another 12 grand for 8 kilobytes of memory, which is about 50 grand today. And if you knew Ralph, man, that money didn't leave his hand real easily. But he did programming. Early 1980s, he developed programs to look at essential fatty acid data. And he loved the speakerphone, and the speakerphones just sucked back in the 80s. so lots of difficult conversations with Dr. Holman screaming. Holman was a fanatic about diet. Ralph could have ate 5-star restaurant anywhere he wanted to, any kind of food he wanted to, but he ate the same thing almost every day. And his breakfast was a whole grain cereal. He mixed 4 different types of cereals together fastidiously and some fruit. For lunch, it was always 1 to 2 cans of sardines. He mixed it up sometimes, mustard sauce or tomato sauce, always in water. And 2 cups of mixed vegetables. He avoided omega-6 rich oils. He ate a lot of fish and vegetables for dinner. He did like his cake. He did like ice cream. Those are his luxuries. There was a Sterling Cafe about 4 blocks from his house, and they would have his meal ready by the time he got there, and that was always a fish sandwich, salad, and a slice of pie. But I'm afraid the fish sandwich had probably 5 milligrams of any kind of omega-3, but he was still eating fish on a regular basis. So his blood level of total omega-3 was almost 26%, and his omega-6 was about 22%. Ralph had more omega-3 than omega-6, and his omega-3 and HUFA status, which Dr. Lanz has taught us a lot about, was 84%. So Ralph lived and preached his diet. So Ralph lived very frugally. He had a very nice home, but a relatively small home. He didn't fancy luxuries. He did fancy helping people and nurturing people. In 1945, he received a $1,500 research reward that he invested in 3M in Minnesota. In 2005, he had no idea that investment had grown to $678,000. He said, "What do I do with this money?" I said, "I know." But he set up a travel fund for students at Bethel College. So now there's a fund for kids to go to ACS or to AOCS. So what a wonderful thing to do. Later, he doubled the size of the chemistry laboratory with a fairly large donation. And ultimately, he left his life fortune to his church and also to Bethel University because they gave him a chance. They gave him a chance in life, and he was so grateful for that. And that money has done really good things for Bethel University. So it's just such a positive in so many ways. Later life, he enjoyed driving the countryside with his wife Carla in his fancy Kia. His wife Carla went to the nursing home at the St. Mark's Lutheran Home. He was there with her all the time, and Carla had passed away at one point. Ralph continued to go to the nursing home every day and visit with people. There was 5 people, he said, that nobody came to visit. So Ralph was truly a wonderful person in that regard. In 1998, though, he was getting fairly disconcerted about the failure of society to acknowledge the importance of omega-3 fats. So he wrote a paper called The Slow Discovery of the Importance of Omega-3. He called me one day. Our local grocery store had salmon, a rich source of omega-3. He was elated that somebody acknowledged that salmon had omega-3 and that omega-3 was important for the diet. So he was always very happy and optimistic. He constantly said, "I've lived such a blessed and good life." And yes, he liked fish oil. So my lessons, hard work is not going to kill you. Always try to serve people. Really work to eliminate widespread omega-3 deficiency. No manuscript is ever truly finished. Ralph was fastidious about 10, 15 reviews. When in doubt, just do a fatty acid profile. Love of family, friends, tradition. Simple is often the right path and the key path, and take your omega-3 every day. So this is a picture that I love. This is Ralph when he was about 85 years old. I started looking after him a little more intently then, and came to find him on the flat roof of his house one day with a snowblower that he lifted up with a rope. And he always said, "I'm just a stubborn Swede," and this damn snow was on the roof, so he was going to take care of it, and he wasn't going to pay anybody to do it. So here's Ralph at age 85, snowblowing his roof in Minnesota. So he had a favorite power saw as well, too, that had, from the turn of the century, that had no safety features at all, and he wouldn't stop using that, so I ended up cutting the cord, and my friend was quite upset with me, but, but no more accidents. So this is a quote from Ralph. "The journey through the wilderness of omegas has been fascinating and rewarding, and hopefully will benefit mankind. I hope I live to see it." Dr. Ralph Holman. There's some nice write-ups that are much more eloquent than myself. The Lipid Library at AOCS. Susan Allport, the author, also has a book called The Queen of Fats. There's a couple attachments that I left you with that were things that Ralph wrote about living life, and that's linked into the presentation material from GOED. But this is a final picture of Dr. Holman. Ralph spent his life defining balance, and he knew balance, and he lived balance, and he died peacefully from complications of pneumonia. And he rests. This is in Upsala, Minnesota, at his cabin. He rests just a few miles of here on a very peaceful hillside surrounded by pine trees, deer, birds, the whole deal. So that's Dr. Holman. Thank you very much.